TLC Radio. This is your host, Ilana Levin. Film history, manga influences, fashion choices, and social commentary. This is the way we talk about The Mandalorian. I swear this isn't normally a Star Wars podcast, even though you should definitely check out our Rise of Skywalker episode that we just posted the other day, and we have covered all of the recent Star Wars-y movies of recent years. But yeah, there's a lot of Star Wars right now, and we have a lot to say about it, from the filmmaking and cultural influences behind it. So yeah, of course, we're going to cover it. I have spoken. And joining me are two awesome guests. Brandon Wilson is a filmmaker and lecturer born and raised in Los Angeles. He attended UCLA, where he took a BA in African American Studies and an MFA from the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. Wilson has directed two micro-budget features, 2005's The Man Who Couldn't, which is on YouTube, and Sepulveda from 2016, which is streaming for free on Vimeo. Wilson has taught film analysis for filmmakers and introduction to editing courses at UCLA. He also teaches at Columbia College Hollywood and Long Beach Community College. In 2020, he'll begin hosting a monthly cinema salon at the Metaphor Club, a Black-owned workspace and lounge for creatives in Leimert Park. He blogs and has been a guest on several film-oriented podcasts, including mine. He tweets regularly as @GeniusBastard. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
And joining me is Veronique Emma Hubois. Veronique Emma Hubois is a fiercely queer critic, cartoonist, and consultant most recently spotted in the Pacific Northwest, writing her Transmascara column for Comicosity and hosting Read from the Rafters on YouTube as her drag persona, Judith Slays. Named one of sci-fi's most influential women in genre 2017, her credits include Love is Love for IDW/DC, Critical Chips Volume 2 for Shortbox, and Called Into Being, 200 Years of Frankenstein. Welcome back, Emma.
It's a pleasure to be back.
It feels like it's been a lifetime since I've had you on the show, and I apologize for that. We should do this more.
Yes, there like entire empires have risen and fallen since I was last here.
I think I want to start by just having a few minutes that'll be spoiler-free, in case people are just deciding if this is a show they want to watch, and then we will go full spoiler shortly after. So, as for me, I almost didn't see the show. I literally knew nothing about it other than the posters. The posters looked quite compelling, but I wasn't going to go and sign up for Disney Plus. I was just feeling really angry at Disney in general, and also didn't want any additional streaming services. And then when I was seeing the family on Thanksgiving, my brother was like, "Okay, guys, let's watch the Mandalorian premiere," and I was certainly not going to say no. And then I was like pretty immediately hooked on it. So obviously I'm enjoying the show, or else I wouldn't be sticking around and covering it. Unlike, for example, Batwoman, which I had intended to cover for the show and couldn't make myself keep watching, even though it wasn't like straight up bad. It just wasn't enough to keep me watching. So in case listeners, if you were wondering, are we going to get around to covering Batwoman? I guess the answer is no. So I suppose that is definitely a clear stamp of me saying that I've enjoyed this show. It's got a lot of competition right now. Brandon, how did you get into the show?
So yeah, I mean, I heard about it, and I had pretty much vowed I would never get Disney Plus. Then the more I saw about the show, the more I began to cave. And also, I have a 7-year-old, about the 8. So I mean, God bless parents who can hold the line for their Disney hatred in the face of it having a kid. But with my kid, yeah, I kind of need all the help I can get, and he actually watches Pinocchio almost daily. But in any case, yeah, I sort of decided to go ahead and watch and get the program, the service. And I've been watching and following and their plans and knowing what they were up to with the show, and I was very. I've been very pleased with it. I think in a lot of ways this is sort of the future, the best future we can hope for Disney's stewardship of the Star Wars franchise. I think going smaller and focusing on characters and telling sort of smaller stories is really kind of the only way forward. I think we're all kind of over the sort of epic narrative. At least I am. Maybe I'm projecting on everyone else.
No, I agree with you. I agree with what you said.
Yeah. So anyway, I will talk more, but I as a fan of westerns and samurai films, also they kind of, it's kind of irresistible for me with what they're doing and what they're up to.
Well, that brings me to you, Emma. I reached out to you because I thought there was a pretty good chance you'd read Lone Wolf and Cub, which is an epic, famous, just groundbreaking manga series. And it was clear, even though I hadn't read any Lone Wolf and Cub when I began watching the show, I was familiar enough with the archetype to say, yeah, we should definitely have someone who's familiar with Lone Wolf and Cub in here. And I reached out to you, and you said yes, and that you'd watch The Mandalorian. But I did not, and while I had assumed you probably knew Wolf and Cub, I was not necessarily sure that you were watching The Mandalorian. So what is your top-line review of Mandalorian?
Well, it's kind of funny because I did not anticipate such a direct link to Lone Wolf and Cub until the reveal of the baby at the end of, the first episode. Mm-hmm. And so even then it was kind of like, well, how long is this baby going to be in the show? But then you also kind of know it's a super sophisticated robot. So you're thinking, well, if they're going to spend the money, this thing is probably sticking around. So I was like, I really hope this is what they're doing. But I got into the show. I have a friend actually who works at ILM, and he gave me one of the early promo posters, and I just kind of set it on a shelf, and I was like, well, who knows? Might be good, might be bad, no idea. And then the teaser dropped, and so my initial attraction to this series was very much as a film and TV nerd who just loves to follow character actors and these kinds of things. So as soon as Pedro Pascal was announced, I was like, okay, that's cool. But then you show me this trailer that has Gina Carano, Carl Weathers. Obviously, we didn't know Nick Nolte was under there initially. And Giancarlo Esposito from from Breaking Bad and Once Upon a Time. That was huge. I was like, this is such an incredible cast of people, and Werner Herzog. It's I would have signed up for this show just based on Werner Herzog's voiceover in the teaser, but and also just that arresting shot of the of those stormtrooper helmets on pikes. I was like, okay, this is going to be something special that is carrying forward the spirit of what we saw in Rogue One with Forrest Whitaker's character and that kind of thing, seeing more of that side of the world, and also the pseudo antagonist from Solo. There's this undercurrent of us getting to see the wider world of what the galaxy was like under Imperial rule that we haven't seen in any of the three trilogies. So there was a lot going on, and then you get the reveal of the baby finally when the first episode comes out, and I was like, wow, this could be Lone Wolf and Cub. This could be where we're going, and it is.
Yeah, that sounds totally right on. And what better collapse of the sort of gulf between auteur cinema and Disney is there than Werner Herzog talking to a Muppet? That just blew me. Of all the directors who I thought would maybe make an appearance on this, I was just simply stunned. And apparently Werner Herzog was the voice who was you guys have to keep this as a Muppet, you cannot make this CGI.
Yes.
And Werner was super right. Yeah, Werner Herzog. Since I've just been babbling about him, does anybody want to reflect on the significance of that? I mean, it's interesting because for a world in which we have this giant Nazi metaphor running around all the time, we haven't really had the German accent.
Right.
We just haven't had that before, and here we have our first straight up, German accented actor, and he's basically playing Nazi scientist in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's right there. I love the bit of the costume design that he's got this imperial medallion, kind of like the Iron Cross that you associate with the German, sort of World War II era German uniform. Obviously quite deliberate and, of course, very resonant with the moment we're living in. The idea that the Empire never really just, yes, we danced with the Ewoks, yes, the Empire fell, but yeah, there were plenty of people who still were believers. It's actually, it's going to be interesting watching it whether how much it chooses to tee up the First Order and how much it tees up the fact that these elements, the machinery, the ideology is still out there and it's never completely dormant. Even the way that, say, we perceive dormancy in our world of similar fascist ideologies, that, it'll be interesting to see how they build on that. But yeah, obviously the very deliberate use of Herzog's accent, and yeah, we never have seen a German accented Imperial before. But very well handled, and again, like Emma said, we've never really. It's amazing how much we have not seen of the Star Wars universe because we hew so close to Luke and Leia and Han and their story, which is central. But yeah. Even with a show, and I think that's why something like Clone Wars, which of course we're going to be talking a lot about, a show like that has, really gained a following for the way that it is able to open up the world and take the smallest characters that maybe we've seen in one film and sort of, build a whole episode or world off of that character. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes, and yeah, of course, we're having this whole conversation right now about auteur cinema versus what I call big genre, which just my sort of name for what Disney is sort of mounting. Obviously, with Scorsese and his comments about Marvel, and so yeah, it was kind of an interesting counterpoint to see Herzog, who participating in this show. And again, obviously Herzog is much more open to certain, participating in culture of the day. He's not somebody that really sees himself as being on Mount Olympus, and he is perfectly happy to make appearances in TV shows and films. So yeah, it was an interesting on that level as well.
I think like this series is what all of my friends who are dissatisfied with, and I was dissatisfied too, with the most recent movie were asking for. Do you know what I mean? Right. This is like what about everybody else? And like, what about the fact that we know that even when the leadership of a fascist system collapses, like the people who followed it don't go away. They still have those beliefs and they still have those systems in order. Like, I think this is, if you're like wondering what else is out there, like this sort of answers that question. And I would just say to listeners, from here on, I would say there's spoilers.
But even to rewind again to Herzog a bit, I mean, there is a significance that he does have that German accent. But to me, there was such a shift in the aesthetics and the presentation of fascism in Star Wars with him, because we're talking about this post-collapse, but you see him there, and just the energy that he brings to that character and the setting that he's in really evokes like a Nazi war criminal hiding out in Buenos Aires or somewhere like Argentina post-war. One of these guys that the Vatican would have helped smuggle out in the real world, and that to me was spectacular, because the problem with fascism and fascist aesthetics in Star Wars typically is that since day one, they have always been conscious of, we want this to look sleek and fun and cool because we want to sell you toys. We want to sell you a Darth Vader toy. We want to sell you a Stormtrooper toy, and all of these things. And like the sort of the nadir or the apotheosis, depending on how you want to look at this, is something like Captain Phasma, right? I mean, we love Gwendolyn Christie, don't get me wrong. She's a great actress and all this, but she's in this big, shiny, kind of pseudo Stormtrooper armor, and it's just kind of like, yes, this is a cool design, but this is like a fascist Nazi analog officer we're talking about here, right? So, and all of these guys, like typically the Moffs and the high up Imperial guys, they all look like, British World War I commanders. They look like the guys that killed Mel Gibson in Gallipoli, right? And so there's always this weird dissonance of like, people want to read Star Wars textually as like anti-fascist or like a freedom fighter metaphor, but there's still so much tension in selling us this cool image of the bad guys, whereas there's no investment in doing that in that same way in this series, because you've got these scout troopers sitting there casually punching a baby, and these other guys with just their grimy stormtrooper uniforms and this kind of stuff. So it's really refreshing to see just how much beyond the novelty effect of, hey, it's the Grizzly Man guy in Star Wars, he was able to bring to that character, and what a seismic shift in this side of the franchise it kind of signals.
Well, this is something that I was kind of struggling with in the last episode, was Giancarlo Esposito. I've been a fan of him since Homicide: Life on the Street, when he was he was that rare late season new character that people actually liked. Like, that's a miracle when a show can have a late season new character and have people like them. I don't know that we'd seen somebody in the leadership of that high up of the Empire who was black before. I know we have seen a few black bridge soldiers and other people of color on the bridge in The Last Jedi, if I'm not mistaken, but that's not even the same as being as big as him. How is that as a political decision, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I recall when I saw Force Awakens, I was kind of struck by the fact that for the first time we were seeing non-white people, non-white officers, Imperial officers. That was sort of because that was something that you did not see in the original trilogy ever, and I'm sure quite deliberately. I mean, also humanoid, which we never really talk about, the fact that there's never a non-humanoid Imperial officer, that also seems to be sort of a baked-in sort of bigotry sort of in their sort of system. What's funny for me is I guess my first experience with Esposito, because I'm a little older than you, is School Days with and so and then School Days, yes, Spike Lee is trying to present both sides. For those who haven't seen it, it takes place a homecoming weekend at a black college, and it really is sort of dealing with the sort of on-campus war between the Greeks and the sort of activists, which people would now refer to as being woke, but this was over 30 years ago. So and again, it's clear whose sympathies we're supposed to have here. Spike Lee is not making it a even or. So he says some really sort of contemptible things in that, but he does it with such force and presence. And so it reminded me almost like I've always had it in my head that if you want someone who's got a mouth very questionable or objectionable things, but also be magnetic and sort of compelling and charismatic, he's your go-to. And it's been great seeing his career sort of unfold, especially in the last 10 years. It was a very interesting choice. And I think what's interesting is that going back to what Emma's saying, in a way, Moff Gideon's arrival sort of undoes a lot of that, because it is okay, here he is in the TIE fighter, this incredible entrance, with the TIE fighter with the wings that sort of fold, and he steps out, and it's this is the Empire back. This is not some older guy hiding in the back room with a bunch of grimy stormtroopers. This guy's sort of showing that no, he still carries this air of authority and power, and presents himself as such, as if the Empire is still going. It's a fascinating character. Very interesting that they waited until sort of the last sort of storyline to reveal him, and of course the big reveal in the final scene that he is in possession of the darksaber that we were introduced to in Clone Wars. I wonder about that, because I feel like they're setting a lot of things up for season 2, and I wonder how much season 2 is going to be able to hold on to the sort of I know some people were frustrated with some of the episodes of Mandalorian, feeling that they were just too sort of self-contained and too small stakes. I want to say I love that about The Mandalorian, because I am, this year especially, when we've seen so many big things, franchises come to a close, and they're never completely satisfying, in my opinion. There's always something I'm kind of like, well, okay. I really just have relished the fact that we are getting something that feels big, but is also very small stakes, and
Yeah.
and it feels like people are kind of wrestling with that. Like, but he's not trying to find out the identity of some crucial character that's gonna have earth-shattering ramifications for the galaxy. And I'm like, no, that's what's great about it. It's just these small little adventures that, the less he says, the better, in my opinion. And yeah, I love all that. But of course, the show, we get the reveal of the name. We've got a dark saber wielding Imperial officer standing on top of a wrecked TIE fighter. So it feels like we're going to move into maybe something that feels a little less a little less minimalist in season 2, but we'll have to wait and see. But
I have two thoughts on that, though. Like, I've literally heard people say that because the show is so episodic that it's like Star Wars for kids, and I just was like, episodic television doesn't mean it's for kids. And in fact, all the great episodic TV, all the great kids cartoons I'm addicted to now are all highly serialized, and I don't really know of another show that I'm watching that is as episodic as this, and it's such an interesting creative choice. Like, it's definitely feels like a throwback in those ways, and I'm enjoying that. But in terms of the small scale, I do think that this show, especially in the finale, sort of postulates that the future of this child is as important as anything, and that the future of all the individual children, like, it's, the show asks you to care about children a lot. Like, you have all of these flashbacks to Mando as a kid, and you have all the little kids, and the episode that's the Magnificent Seven, like total Magnificent Seven episode, is
the
very
Seven
grounded.
Samurai. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, one's a derivative of the other. I'm just being
right.
Yeah. No. It's yes. That is. I have seen one of those movies more than the other, but yes, thank you. Let's give the original film its due. I think it actually is also saying that what happens to all these children is extremely important. Emma, do you want to talk with me a little bit about Lone Wolf and Cub with this show?
I do, but first I need Brandon to explain the darksaber to me, because I was like,
yes,
what is this thing? Because I haven't seen any of the Clone Wars cartoon.
Nor have I.
But I have a sense of like how deeply enmeshed in the production it is, because I can't remember his name, but one of the main producers of Clone Wars works on Mandalorian, and I believe he was one of the X-Wing pilots in that one episode.
So yeah, Dave Filoni directed. There's just a few directors on the show. Everyone, I think, did 2, except for Taika Waititi, who did the last episode. So
Bryce Dallas Howard, I think, only did 1.
Who's that? Oh, yeah, it's Bryce Dallas Howard. Yeah, she did the Seven Samurai episode. So, so those are the 2 one-offs, and then everyone else did, I believe, 2 episodes. So, Dave Filoni, Rick Famuyiwa, who directed The Wood, if we want to go way back when, and Dope not too long ago. He was one of the other ones. And then Deborah Chow, who is, of course, has been selected to sort of be the director for the Obi-Wan Kenobi series that they're going to be doing. Probably, I don't know if it's next year or year after next. These things take a while. But so in any case, yeah, that was a cool moment where they were all the X-Wing pilots in the prisoner episode. The Prison Break episode. So the darksaber, and I want to say I only sort of watch Clone Wars. Like I probably have not even seen half of them. My 20-year-old is far more versed than myself on this, and he's a Clone Wars fanatic. And he maintains that one of the best sort of story arcs was the sort of when Mandalore became a big part of it, and they got into sort of Mandalore's history. So, long story short, the darksaber first appears in season 2. There's the 12th episode called The Mandalore Plot, and of course, you've got Disney Plus, so you've got all of these, and there's another season of Clone Wars coming, which I didn't realize until like about a week ago. So the Mandalore Plot is about the fact that there is a new regime of Mandalorians that are sort of running things, and they have abandoned the warrior ways of the traditional ways, and they are now pacifists. And there is the head of state is a woman named Duchess Satine, who has, I think, is an old flame of Obi-Wan's, if I'm not mistaken. And it is uncovered that there is a sort of terrorist group called Death Watch that in later seasons becomes important. And in that episode, this is the Mandalore plot, we see the darksaber. We see that a Mandalorian fights Obi-Wan, and he produces this darksaber that was stolen from a Jedi temple. As I understand it, the darksaber was made by a Mandalorian Jedi long time ago in the past. And it's a one-of-a-kind lightsaber. It's single edge. The blade's a little different, so that actually you can see like one side is the blade and one side is not. I don't know how that works with a lightsaber. So it comes up in later seasons, and it also comes up again on the later show Star Wars Rebels, which is set in just before A New Hope. It comes up there too with Mandalorians. This weapon is hugely important to Mandalorians. It's like this, because of their history with the Jedi, because it's one of a kind. So the fact that Moff Gideon, who we have been teased as like, the Henry Kissinger of Mandalore, and has this war criminal, this sort of reviled war criminal. The fact that he has it indicates that he's going to be this sort of a primary antagonist in a way we haven't had in the show up to now. And I mean, obviously, if they're ever introducing it at the end of the first season, my guess is it's going to be Mando's mission is to sort of reclaim the darksaber because for Mandalorians, because it's theirs and it sort of belongs to them, and so that's the sort of long and short of that. And it is the first time that the darksaber has ever appeared in a live action, in any sort of live action. So that's pretty cool. And in a way, of course, I'm also, veteran listeners of the podcast know I'm also a big Marvel nerd. So it's kind of cool that this show has been much more integrated in terms of the films, but also the series and other elements than I think we've seen in what Marvel's TV work so far has done. Of course, now we're going to get a whole new type of Marvel show coming soon because of the change with Disney Plus. But yeah, it's cool that clearly there's been a few gestures, a few nods to the animated series that Filoni's run as being canon and part of the story.
And it's funny, I've had people highly recommend those series to me before, and the one I began watching, I just found the animation style was not for my tastes, which had kind of been established pre-weird 3D animation-iness, but it makes me curious enough to want to consider it again. I think the aesthetics of this show are just really strong. Like, they have really put a lot of thought into all the cinematography, all of the art direction as well, and the music and the sound design. And I feel like it was more careful and thoughtful about those things than the most recent movie even was. And it knows that what it's drawing from. But yeah, the whole framing of this as being a Lone Wolf and Cub story was definitely a thing that was a reveal from the first episode, because you don't see an adorable baby in the trailers, and they were able to keep that from the public eye for some time. I've literally seen people debating, is this drawing from samurai movies? Is this drawing from westerns? And it's for Christ's sake, it's obviously from both, because those two genres are built off of each other.
Right.
But from the comics as well, when I think about Emma, if you can dig in for a little bit for me with Lone Wolf and Cub, that would be awesome.
I think you kind of want to rewind back to where George Lucas started all of this from, because I think the most powerful argument for why Favreau and his team doing this is so important is because it recaptures and reconstitutes the influence of Japanese film and culture on George Lucas and his decisions to do everything that he did in Star Wars. Because and you can, a lot of people know this, you can find on Wikipedia, but even the word Jedi comes from the Japanese term for the type of samurai period films that Akira Kurosawa started with Rashomon and the Seventh Samurai and all of this. And it's one of my favorite little bits of Star Wars trivia is that George Lucas had pursued Toshiro Mifune, who was, Akira Kurosawa's main leading man for most of his films. That's who he wanted for Obi-Wan Kenobi.
That would have been amazing.
So you can see how the trajectory of the franchise would have changed if Mifune had said yes. I mean, I like to think that, I mean, God bless Ewan McGregor, but we could have had Tadanobu Asano as Obi-Wan in the prequels, and that would have just been mind-blowing, unprecedented. But I mean, we live in the world we live in. But so I love the fact that Favreau and the rest of the creators, that they went back to these original texts to adapt them in honestly the same ways that Marvel does its own comics, right? So they take a look at this, and I mean, Lone Wolf and Cub is like the degree to which it's infiltrated and informed our culture of just pop culture since the 1970s is, you can't overblow it, you can't exaggerate it. And I wrote a piece recently when the writer of it, Kazuo Koike, recently died, just kind of tracing all of the steps of the different ways that individual manga series has been so influential. Because I mean, I think a lot, like most people's direct, I guess contact with it comes from a Wu-Tang Clan song from Fourth Chamber, right? Because you get the English dub of the intro that's supposed to be spoken in the child's voice, describing his father and all of this, and then the beat kicks in, and it's a classic Wu-Tang joint. But you see the clips of it that get played in Kill Bill Volume 2 when Beatrix's daughter is watching it. But the basic idea of it is that Ogami Ito is the executioner for the shogun, right? Like, he's the guy who, executes the death sentences for anybody the shogun decides has to die. And there's kind of a vast conspiracy from another clan that basically they want this prestigious role for their family and to consolidate power within the shogunate. So they set him up as looking disloyal, and they try to have him killed. His wife and son are killed. He survives. His wife dies. Him and his infant son survive, and he comes back to his son, who's just a little infant, the same size as Baby Yoda is in The Mandalorian. And he says to the kid, he says, "You've got two choices." And he puts a ball down, and he puts a knife on the floor, and he says, "Choose the ball, and you'll go with your mother." So he'll kill the son, and he'll be reunited with his mother in heaven. He says, "Or if you take the knife, you come with me, and we're going to go on this journey together." And so the kid crawls over to the knife, and they go on the run together. And he decides the father decides to become a mercenary for hire, in more of like the rural areas outside the capital, to anybody who will hire him. And so along the way, he's got to figure out impromptu childcare, or how he's going to deal with his kid while he's, bounty hunting or assassinating someone or doing all of these various jobs. And there's a big overarching plot, but he's kind of, he's a wandering sword for hire is the whole thing. And so when this started getting picked up and translated into English, you got a whole series of covers that were drawn by Bill Sienkiewicz. Matt Wagner did a couple. Frank Miller did a whole bunch. And so those artists, they were blown away by this, and they were translating into their own work, because like the famous Claremont Miller Wolverine miniseries, like that's where all of the ninja and samurai imagery that Frank Miller was obsessed with came from. It came directly from what Koike and Goseki Kojima, the artist, had done on it. And that just filtered out into our culture, because you've got Miller applied that same stuff to Daredevil with the hand and all of this, and Eastman and Laird come along and they snatch everything that Miller did on Daredevil and they turn it into the Ninja Turtles. The hand becomes the Foot Clan and all this kind of stuff, and so it just disseminates in all of these different directions. And so it's so fascinating to see it come home in Star Wars in such a direct way, that's really about looking back at what was George Lucas thinking about when he made Star Wars. And this was a big, major component of it.
One of the things that was really built in here also was sort of this, him being like this wandering hero going from town to town, and like the ways in which having the child with him shapes his experiences. And I mean, obviously from a dramatic aspect, it heightens the stakes about everything. Like, as if you don't already care about Pedro Pascal and his helmet with the high cheekbones, like you definitely care about the baby. And like you have this confusing sort of like, is this like you want them to stay together, but you also know this is a really dangerous place for the baby to be, and sort of that tension about what you want to have happen there is like part of the drama as well, at least for me. And the other thing is, like, I just really wasn't familiar with Mandalorians and Star Wars lore, and this was such a built out and developed culture in this show. And my understanding is there's some differences between Mandalorian culture as depicted in the show versus some of the other kinds of Star Wars media. But the idea of it being this really like this culture that seems very much grounded in like Bushido, like, samurai culture, and like, losing face versus like keeping your mask on. It's like pretty wild. And at the end, when you have the armorer, who I freaking love her, she's amazing, telling him like, no, the way is you take care of the kid, is like very much answering answering a question that's sort of been left open by him in terms of his relationship to the culture, and for us as viewers in terms of like, what is it that we want to have happen in the story.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me somewhat of what happened with the Klingons in Star Trek, that at first they're this perfect bad guys, just, and then when that gets kind of boring and a new generation comes along, they start to say, well, what if they are also, have this honor code, and we can sort of see that see it from their perspective. I mean, it's almost like us unlearning the sort of, racism against the Japanese and Imperial Japan after the wake of Pearl Harbor, World War II, and then kind of slowly in the post-war period sort of realizing that this is a much more complex culture, and that we can sort of let go of some of our initial, resentments and angers and feelings about, they attacked us and so forth, and start to see them in a more full way. So yeah, it's a lot. It is interesting that even within the show, as I said, with Clone Wars, there's a literal war within the Mandalorians' ranks about what it is to be a Mandalorian. What's new, I think, is that this idea, and this could be something that has been talked about in other media. It's, again, I'm not like I wouldn't call myself an expert on Star Wars expanded universe, and of course some of that stuff has been sort of reduced now to basically has been decanonized essentially. Yeah. But I think it's interesting too that that dialogue is going on within the culture about what are we, what do we stand for, and that they're sort of working it through. And this idea, of course, the big reveal that a Mandalorian at this point is a creed, really more than it is a race. That this is something that you adopt, and then you're a Mandalorian, which has a lot of resonances on lots of levels. It's almost like being an American, or the way that, and I'm fascinated by how Mandalorians. I'm sorry, I knew what I was getting at, and I sort of got away from, was this idea that the Empire purged Mandalore, which I don't think was real. I think that's a new thing that we're learning, that at some point the Empire came in between episodes 3 and 4 and did this sort of decimation of Mandalore, because which makes perfect sense. I mean, they're a warrior race, and they're going to be once they got rid of the Jedi, it makes sense they would turn their attention there. So that's just so fascinating that they are, on the one hand, this sort of they are people that have a lot of blood on their hands, and yet they are also now this sort of oppressed minority that's sort of been forced into the shadows and are very much hunted at the same time. And yet their ranks are open to anybody who's willing to sort of embrace their teachings. I mean, that's all just so interesting. And one last thing, the whole thing about this being for kids. I mean, First of all Star Wars is for kids, for Christ's sake. I mean, this is what Star Wars... I saw Star Wars when I was 6 years old, when it was opening, in its first run, and I loved it. And that's kind of how it should be. I hate, in general, this sort of the edgelord instinct of like, well, now that I'm 40, I think it's time for the things that I loved as a child to reflect that I'm 40. It's like, no, it's time for you to understand that this was something you loved as a kid, and it's okay to add some colors to it and add some dimension to it. But at the end of the day, of course, The Mandalorian should be something that I can watch with my 7-year-old if he will sit still for a moment, and we should be able to enjoy The Mandalorian. And I appreciate that it's reaching for these sort of, as towards certain influences, Peckinpah and Lone Wolf and Cub, that of course I can't watch with my kid, but I appreciate that it's obviously working with those influences. But yeah, it's Star Wars. It shouldn't be something that I can't, so that whole argument is just like, it just is so, to me, absurd and on the face of it, and just, to me, it just says people don't really understand what makes this thing endure, which is that it really can speak to everybody. So, and I'm glad that I feel like they did a great job striking just the right tone. Now, of course, there are moments where you're like, okay, it's Disney, like the Prison Break episode, where they have to go back and show you that the Mandalorian didn't actually kill, even though he would have.
Yeah,
even though
that
he would have.
Wild to me.
Yeah, so they have to go back and show you that he jailed them and didn't kill them. But hey, it's Disney. I get what they have to do. I mean, I don't have a problem with that.
The thing that I also felt like the show must have been showing for kids was in the finale, when you see the full Mando origin story. It was all stuff we already knew, and it's not like I was like, oh God, this is so boring or whatever, but I did kind of feel a little bit condescended, and then I said, oh right, no, maybe right, kids kids might need this like explicitly spelled out for them. I think, I do think in general, like it's also a show that did a good job of combining humor in its moments. Like Amy Sedaris just blew my mind. But I've never seen an actress more dedicated to trying to look ugly than she is. And I know that people are sort of like, well, that's sort of a tribute to Ripley, but like, no, Ripley is beautiful and hot, had hair that was very much of her time period.
Right.
Like, I'm sorry that you find that hair to be disqualifying for a person's attractiveness, but like, and Amy Sedaris, a very attractive person, and she just likes to make herself look ugly. I don't quite understand why. It's kind of fascinating. But that whole design bit is wild to me. And I don't know.
It's a great
costuming. like the wig and prosthetic stuff. I don't know if you have any insight into this from your drag work, Emma.
Oh God, no, I don't. I mean, it's definitely less than Charlize Theron were to do Megyn Kelly in Bombshell. But the whole Mandalorian helmet thing, I mean, there's so many different kind of metaphors and allusions you can draw out of it. And I mean, one of the obvious ones is, of course, like that's how in lucha libre and on Mascarada wrestler, like a masked Mexican wrestler, that's how they treat that, right? Like you don't take that mask off, and it's a big dramatic moment because like when a wrestler who does that, like when they're ready to transition into a new part of their career, they'll do a match where it's like mask versus mask, or mask versus career, or mask versus hair, where like if one person loses, they have to shave their head. If the other person loses, they lose their mask. And it's a big heel move to try to take off a masked wrestler's mask in that context, the same way that you saw I think it was Clancy Brown's character in The Prisoner tried to do that, and I think it happened a couple of times. But the whole and the whole idea of them saying that being a Mandalorian is a creed, not a race. I mean, number one, I love the fact that Carl fucking Weathers was standing right there when she said that line, and I just heard the Rocky theme. I couldn't help it. But
he's so good.
But when but when they say that and that this is a choice and this is something you undergo, there's an opening there to read that as an analog for Islam in certain ways, right? But I mean, we typically think of that for women, right? And the choice of a more modest dress and these kinds of things. So it's kind of interesting that you could get a vague reading of coming to accept the Mandalorians and Mando as being about the broader Islamophobia in the culture, and to the point about the flashback of him as a kid, I think it is kind of politically important to reinforce, that he's a refugee and a victim of genocide. And I mean, right. Cara Dune, this is like a blink and you miss moment, but Gina Carano's character is from Alderaan, and you just get it in this kind of throwaway line. That's right. But then you're like, whoa, wait, hold on. And then you realize, you think back of how well these characters mesh and how much they understand each other and why she was the one to deliver that line. And you're like, yeah, they both suffered basically genocide, right? Like Alderaan was obliterated in one go by the Death Star. And so you kind of see this kind of knit together in that sequence.
And I was happy to see her fleshed out some more in that way. I mean, her character is amazing. I love her. I love having a woman actress who looks like she could actually beat you up, as opposed to one who's like smaller than me, and I'm supposed to believe she can beat me up.
Please watch Haywire. If you have not seen Haywire.
Haywire is good. She's so good in that. And she was so underused in Deadpool. It's like embarrassing how underused.
Yeah. But her fight, I mean, just watching her throw punches, it's kind of amazing. Like, you just don't see that. I mean, you don't see that even with male. I mean, just someone who clearly has thrown a lot of punches, and it just reads very real. Now, her introductory fight scene with the Mandalorian is really for me a highlight of the show. I'm glad to. I mean, I knew they weren't going to kill her off, because she's just too good a character, too good a backup character to have. And I hadn't really thought about the hatred she has. And I love that where she says it's Imperials, and it's like, okay, I'm in. Like, if it's killing Imperials, I will always show up, because that's what that is my thing. That is what I do, right? Because we saw her world get blown up on a whim, basically. I mean, just as a casual thing. That wasn't even the big action in in that particular film. But just really, I mean, the casting in general, I mean, and having Carl Weathers, just knowing that, like, right, someone like him who's been around, and I mean, it does remind you of, like, a great B-Western sort of in the best possible way. Just the way casting people that we have already sort of a certain affinity to, who are not megastars necessarily, but just can just bring it, and we know, and we have a history with them, and we know what they're capable of. So I just was really impressed all the way around, and seeing Clancy Brown, I mean, in that episode, it just very, very, very shrewd casting.
I identified, even though I'm like not a Harry Potter person at all, so I only know her from Game of Thrones, but I identified the actress from Game of Thrones who played Osha like immediately, despite her very, very heavy makeup and acting like super extra. It's like, is there an entire race of aliens whose entire personality is being extra? Because that seems like that's their thing.
That is their thing, yeah.
the Twilek are wild, and I was so excited because I know her from Harry Potter. I guess I mean, I'm sure I saw her in Game of Thrones and didn't realize at the time, but the Twilek are like one of the strangest artifacts of Star Wars, because like the sexual dimorphism in that species is nuts, because like all of the females of the species are just total babes, and like most of them that show up in the films and even the extended universe are like strippers or sex workers or trafficked or just in that vein, and like just super hypersexualized. And then all of the males of the species just look like complete dirtbags. So there's probably some like weird latent Orientalism going on there or something. But like it's hilarious, because when BioWare came around to make Mass Effect, and they're like, we're going to make our dark, serious, adult Star Wars, they just completely removed the male of the species, and they created a whole species of like these sexy blue chicks that's basically just Twi'leks if they were all women somehow. It's wild.
I just hate how so much fantasy just has like sexual dimorphism, i.e. whether like people's bodies looking strikingly different based on like what their assumed, like gender would be, is so extreme, like much more so than it would be in any human. And it's all because they don't want to have there be any women who they don't want to fuck.
Right.
Like that's it. Right. And it's just like, no, don't. It offends me on so many levels. It offends me how limited their palette is of what's attractive. And it offends me that the female characters must all be sexually desirable to heterosexual men. And like, and God forbid that the men be sexy. Although I seriously give this one props for like, this has been a topic of conversation. Mando is hot despite functionally not having a face. And there was, I think the conclusion we drew, I was just sort of like, well, it's because his mask, his cheekbones, he's got a good voice, and we do know ultimately that Pedro Pascal is underneath that.
I was going to say, we do know.
But like the mask's cheekbones are a lot more pronounced than they are on some of the other bounty, than like Boba Fett and stuff like that. And he's just so very shiny. It's good design. Yeah. It really is.
It is. I mean, that was a great moment when he comes out in the full Beskar armor, and it almost feels like it begins to almost feel like this is a long origin story, of him, even though he's not new. He's got a long history of this kind of work, but somehow it's like this is where he's really kind of becoming and transforming into something new.
One of the big transformations, obviously, through the story, and it's one you could see a mile away, was Mando starting by hating droids to Mando realizing that a droid, it's sort of like the Mandalorian being Mandalorian, and their culture is sort of choosing a certain kind of programming for how you want to act, and that the droids they can't choose their own programming, but we can choose the programming that we give them, and the end result of that. And I definitely feel like from the second he's like, it's better not be a droid, at the beginning of the series, you're like, yes, droid, he's going to come around on this,
right?
And I don't know. I thought, what were thoughts about that particular storyline?
Yeah, it's interesting because anti-droidism, I guess we can call it, has been a sort of a theme throughout from the going back to the first film, and of course the great little thing where when he returns to the cantina from the Mos Eisley cantina from episode 4, where once droids were sort of forbidden, now the entire staff are droids, and there's a droid inside, so that's definitely there. I do think that the flashback in the finale in episode 8 did sort of drive home that it was a droid that almost killed him, and I guess that's the Clone Wars, which I sort of did the math. So yeah, I guess that would have been the Clone Wars when his planet was being decimated, that genocide was happening, and then it was a Mandalorian who saves him and extends the hand, and so of course now you understand why what happened in the first episode happened, because it was literally the same thing with him reaching out to the baby. So I appreciate how they kind of parsed that out and unfold and slowly revealed what we needed to know about him. And it even worked that the droid comes back in the last episode. And of course, that this is going to be his arc, that him learning to sort of let go of his hatred, and actually care about a droid sort of sacrificing himself for the greater good. But hey, it works. I mean, it works well, and it's and I applaud them for thinking about that and giving a successful arc. I mean, it is very striking to me how much more satisfying this 8 episodes have been than the trilogy that is also wrapping up at exactly the same time, which botched so many things, in my opinion, especially in terms of world building and like understanding, like, this is what's going on here, and this is what has happened, and this is why these people feel this way, because of it's just amazing how poorly that's been handled in the recent trilogy, and how well it was done here. So I mean, I'm not trying to. I don't think it's a bold prognostication to say this feels like this is where Star Wars needs to be, and less Episode 9 and Solo. Less trying to do these big stories on the big screen, and more just kind of focusing in on characters it almost reminds me of what happens with Westerns in the 50s, you know, and I think this is interesting, relevant also, because Westerns, somewhat like musicals, people have these sort of ideas, very fixed ideas about them, and they think they don't like them, and they think they are just one thing, when in fact, I think in both Westerns and musicals, regardless of your disposition or taste, you can probably find one that fits you if you really spend the time to look for it. It's not, you know, monolithic thing. So with Star Wars, I think the films are not so much like 50s Westerns, and by that I mean in the sort of 30s and 40s you have Westerns where, yeah, this is the sort of cliche of the Western, that there's white hats and black hats, that there's a certain there's a tending towards myth, you know, or real life figures like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. But in the 50s, and again, maybe I have this wrong, maybe this is just my personal take on it, but in the 50s you have a new psychology sort of entering the Western. You have sort of the war and what happened in the war sort of entering the Western, and you also start to get sort of shadings of characters, shades of gray, and so you start to have, you know, and specifically I'm thinking of two cycles: the Anthony Mann cycle of Westerns with Jimmy Stewart, that he did about 6 of them, and then also the similar cycle that Bud Bedecker does with Randolph Scott. And in those Westerns, you really start to change, you start to move into something they move away from sort of what already was a cliche even in the 50s for Westerns. You start to have heroes that have their own, that have stuff that they're trying to work through and work out, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. You have characters that are basically decent but also have done terrible things. And so, yeah, to me, and also, especially Bedekers are so minimalist. Sometimes there's stretches where no one's talking, and this show kind of definitely reminds me of that kind of Western. And it's interesting to think that Star Wars is going through a certain sort of cycle and arc the way the Western did, and then of course that leads to Peckinpah in the 60s, which they also just a little bit hint at a few times. I think every time Mando grabs a big gun and fires it, I'm thinking of Pike, you know, at the end of the Wild Bunch, and even the two-part finale, you know, felt very much had that sort of slightly apocalyptic, like, okay, this is it, and if we're gonna go out, let's go out this way.
Well, it's like you have till sundown. Like,
right.
You're never gonna have. No one will ever say you have till sundown in any other kind of Star Wars property.
Right.
You know, people fret a lot, and understandably, Lord knows, about the dominance of superhero media, but people forget that cowboy movies were everything, and cowboy TV shows were everything for decades in America. This was like the hugest genre for such a long time. So we've been through cycles like that, you know, in the past. So it's interesting to see that kind of getting brought back through the same engine that's providing us with like our endless supply of superheroes, basically.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, you know, apologies for bringing him up, but that Tarantino really kind of broke that open for me, because I was a Western skeptic. I mean, I love the remake of True Grit, with the Coen Brothers one, and there was a couple explicit Westerns along the way that was like, okay, sure, but you know, after Django and just kind of how much Tarantino was talking about what went into it, then you look up films like The Great Silence, so you get into Peckinpah and these kind of things, and you sort of see that open up, and kind of like, and Tarantino railing against John Ford, you know, and making fun of him with the Ku Klux Klan guys in Django Unchained. But you do see that pervasiveness of the Western in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, right?
Yes.
Where it just, you know, but then there's other directors like James Mangold, right, who, the reason why Logan is called Logan is because it's referencing Shane, right? And that he wanted to kind of do a similar thing. And it's so funny because the Prisoner episode is, I believe it's credited to Christopher Yost, who is the co-creator of X-23, who was...
Oh, shit.
Right? Because he co-created her on X-Men Evolution back in the day, right? And so he comes back to do a space Western episode, and that really kind of... There's so many, like, loops of the animation and comics and genre world that just keep circling back on each other, right? That you see this name and you're like, oh, I know who that is.
You know, one character type that was in this that I hadn't seen in other Star Wars was the like bounty hunter Trustafarian kid who hires him to help. And like, we all know that guy is going down.
Right.
That was definitely a new character type for the series.
Yes, but it's also that kind of kid is like such a Western trope. You know, the kid he's got all the gear. He's heard the stories. He's gonna force his way into sort of the mythology, and he has no clue. And he usually ends up getting himself killed. And that he's got a real ruthless streak. And again, that was in case anyone missed it, that was Jake Cannavale, who's got an amazing family tree. He is Sidney Lumet's grandson. He is Lena Horne's great grandson, and Bobby Cannavale and Ginny Lumet's son. So yes,
wow.
Yeah. So that's him, and he did a great job, I think, portraying this kind of kid. That the second you see him sitting in Han Solo's seat, no less, which is a great touch, where he shot Greedo. You get it, and again, I mean there's a certain that's the whole pleasure of the Western, though, is seeing these things play out in new ways and seeing the tropes brought up, and you kind of know where it's going, but you want to see how it plays out this time around. And so, we got to also mention the end of the Gunslinger. There's a very good chance that was Boba Fett at the end of the Gunslinger, going to the body of Ming-Na Wen's character. That's because there's there's been videos done already where there's a spur sound with the steps, and if you go back in Empire Strikes Back, when Boba Fett steps out in Cloud City, you hear those sort of spurs. And it's because at first it was a little confusing when I watched the episode. I thought it was Mando. We were going back to see that Mando had sort of taken something off her body or buried her or something, but no, and then it cuts. So I was thinking that this is where we were going for the finale, but that means that they may be saving it for season 2, that Boba Fett actually is alive, and that this is going to be either an ally or an antagonist to the Mandalorian. So
I think that's definitely on its way. I mean, fans are going to just demand that to happen, and it's easy enough to do a Boba Fett with a costume and all that.
Yes.
Your point about the Trustafarian bounty hunter as a type, it made me think about specifically like Ricky Nelson and Rio Bravo, for example. And the thing is, he never played a pop song for us, so he's like actually worse than Colorado. But what we did get a lot of was just stunning composed music throughout. Often with Western echoes and lots of Star Wars-y themes to it, and I wish I had more to say about it other than it was magnificent.
That's Academy Award winner Ludwig Göransson, who did the music for Black Panther. So he's the composer for Mandalorian. And I think they wanted something that had, since he did such an amazing job with the Black Panther score, finding African instruments and using them, and sort of giving it this sort of feeling like this was sort of old music, and with the Mandalorian, the sense of this being an old culture and feeling somewhat alien while also feeling like the sort of fitting in the Star Wars, it's the Star Wars sort of sound. They did a really terrific job, or he did a really terrific job.
Baby Yoda obviously is the breakout star from the series, and it would have been so easy for that to go wrong. I have to just honor the fact that it went right. I mean, obviously one of the big problems with the worst very much non-humanoid character from Star Wars, which was Jar Jar Binks, was that character was a racist stereotype, and like you do that, you're hampering your ability to have anything good happen. But I think
in The Prisoner, there's that they kind of recognize that, right? There's that. What are you, a Gungan under there?
Gungan, right. Yeah, that was amazing. So like having it, letting Baby Yoda, like be animatronic and a puppet rather than being animation, I think was really wise. I loved looking at all of his little baby teeth. Like whenever he opens his mouth and you see he's got these little tiny teeth, I was like, that's just, for some reason, that is part of the cuteness, I think. Because obviously, you have the giant eyes, and the giant eyes is what makes anything cute. But there was like these subtle notes like that, the little fingers that look like a toddler's fingers, his little noises, the head tilting, just amazing puppet design. And I just don't know, I don't think you need to compare Babu Frick with Baby Yoda. We can love them both.
Oh, what? Sorry?
Babu Frick from the movie?
From
Babu
episode
Frick?
9. The mechanic.
I am blessed enough to not have seen it.
Okay.
All I know is that Taika Waititi's IG droid got a more respectful send-off than C-3PO apparently, so that's something.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
But they have a really excellent Muppet in Rise of Skywalker also, and I just think people have been making a fake competition that isn't necessary between my two adorable puppets who I love.
I agree. And I just want to say, I find it incredibly gratifying that Baby Yoda, they were either they were just so trying to honor this surprise at the end of the first episode, or they just kind of were caught flat-footed. The fact that we didn't have walls of Baby Yodas for sale this month is amazing to me. That something that took off so quick, and it's like the toys aren't there yet, so people have literally started making their own sort of Baby Yoda swag. It's kind of you really don't see that too much in this culture, where it seems like everything is sort of tested. I mean, even the Mandalorian. I mean, I have I got a kid, so I know what's on the shelves, and the fact that he's not on the shelf everywhere, that the Christmas season came and this thing that took off wasn't already just there, is that's kind of remarkable. It just kind of makes you realize, okay, humans are doing this after all, and someone just didn't think that to have these a billion Baby Yoda toys ready for stocking stuffers. But
Mm-hmm. Well, somebody also finally put out there yes, stormtroopers are really bad shots, and we're going to do a bit about it.
Oh yes,
right.
That was it was so funny and excruciating at the same time, because every time he punched the bag, I was like, "Are you kidding me? I'm going to kill you!" But he's going to get killed messily at some point, and then they're sitting there just taking the shots, and neither one of them is saying a word. Oh God! But
I think I think they punched the baby too much, and that was unnecessary. But I think the bad shots was very necessary.
Oh yeah.
That was pretty hysterical.
And they have a lot of different stormtrooper designs and styles that are used through this in different ways, and you see different sort of fighting styles. It's pretty fleshed out with the stormtrooper lore, I think, in this.
There was some nice design echoes. I just wanted to say to Rogue One with the the Death Troopers and black, and then also, Moff Gideon's sort of look was definitely took a lot from Krennic and of course the original trilogy, but also a lot from Krennic and Rogue One.
Rogue One.
I don't think we could have had the Mandalorian without Rogue One. I think that was a massive inflection point in the franchise.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, that movie was amazing. I have 2 whole podcasts that did about it because I had so much to say, and I feel like there could always be more.
Mm-hmm.
The painted titles at the end of each episode, I think, are one of the most beloved features of it.
Yes.
And I think it speaks to how great art, painted art, can be, and how it would be very much worth it for Marvel to invest in letting the Star Wars, comics, which have had some fabulous artists on them, don't get me wrong, Salvador Larroca was great, for example, but let there be some more full-on painted art, let that art sort of be in the foreground, because people just responded to it. It just called back to classic movie posters in a really powerful way.
Well, I think those are actual process drawings, because it kind of sounded like, I just saw that video of, I think it may have been a D23 panel. I'm not sure where it was, but Pedro Pascal was talking on a panel about how when he came in for initial talks, they had all of this art up on the walls that sounded like those end credit crawls. And he was looking at the characters and he said, Jon Favreau, am I that one or that one? And then Favreau says, no, he wants you to be the Mandalorian, and he was just stunned. So I think those are that is process art and like storyboards for the series. That's kind of been my assumption all along.
Cool. So we've come up on an hour. Do you folks have stuff that you want to hit on for sure before we go?
I guess one little thing that jumped out at me to get back to Herzog's character, because I just always want to get back to his character though, is that when we talk about the idea of prejudices and how we're reading the Mandalorians and their history, it's so fascinating is that one of the most kind of authentically sort of like Nazi things about Herzog's character is how he fetishizes and seems to try to project a sense of respect for the Mandalorians, while at the same time obviously being part of the machine that that perpetrated a genocide against them, right? He says, look how majestic the Beskar is when it's on a real Mandalorian. It's like, oh, it's too bad that the Mandalorians are dying out and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of like, as an art history major, you really see that same kind of like that modernist primitivist perspective, the kind of way that Picasso approached African art, the way that Emily Carr was painting totem poles in the Pacific Northwest, and this sort of salvage and these salvage and primitivist paradigms that are like seeking to kind of fetishize or quote unquote honor something from the perspective of the group that was also responsible for those practices being suppressed or those peoples being displaced. And that really struck me as such a unexpectedly authentic thing to see in action in Star Wars.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it actually called to mind today, like that really fucked up eugenics piece in the New York Times by, Brett Stevens.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I'm complimenting Jews, but by leaning into racial stereotypes in ways that are actually dangerous for everybody. It has that same exact tone, I thought. It is really quite haunting. Do you, Brandon, do you have any final thoughts for?
No, I feel like I kind of have said my piece. I think it will be interesting to see how much we retain. I hope that they don't completely lose the sort of episodic nature of it. If you look at this one, I mean, really, okay, so there's 8 episodes. Really, in a way, the first 3 are kind of very tightly knit. This is the first job, the decision to take the child, and also the the fallout that comes from this absconding with the baby, culminating with the great moment where all the Mandalorians show up. Again, just straight out of the Western, and these things work. That's why they've survived. Seeing a bunch of Mandalorians fly into action, even though this is an incredibly destructive choice for them, works. And then, of course, the last 2 episodes are kind of really a 2-parter where we have Gideon introduced. And really, so that means we have 3 in the middle that I think is where people sort of started to wonder what this was about, that are sort of self-contained. The Sanctuary, which is 7 Samurai, and then the Gunslinger, which is just, again, a great 50s Western, and then the Prison Break. And to me, I think that was the strength of it, is giving us a character that we sort of, identify with, and that we know but we don't know, and letting us see the sort of darker sort of aspects of the Star Wars universe that don't have to do with the Senate or rebuilding the Jedi. And I'm hoping that they manage to sort of maintain that, even though I feel like inevitably there's going to be a sort of a move towards a slightly more sort of substantive or stories with greater repercussions. I mean, seeing the darksaber, okay, this is where we're going with that, and this is he's going to have to get that darksaber back, and in doing so, he's going to become something for his people that he probably has no interest in being right now. So yeah, and also just the central. I'm very interested to see how the sort of metaphor of the Mandalorians continues to sort of evolve and play out, and where we see their culture next. So yeah, but go ahead.
No, I was just saying. Well, thank you both for joining me. Where can our folks find your work? Emma, let us know specifically that Lone Wolf and Cub piece. Where can we find that?
That is on Comicosity, under the Transmuscura heading. I have my own section of the website. You can find us from just comicosity.com.
Cool, thank you. And you're on Twitter as
EMMAHOUXBOIS.
Fabulous. And Brendan, where can folks find your work online?
I am on Twitter all the time as Genius Bastard. Also, you can find, I've got a blog, which I actually don't think I've touched in about almost a year now, but I'll definitely be writing a sort of end of the decade sort of summation. That's geniusbastard.blogspot.com. So you can find, I also got essays there. I wrote a piece about toxic fandom just like days after The Last Jedi was released that I think has held up very, very well. So you can find pieces, essays like that there.
Fabulous. And I, of course, am at Graphic Policy Radio Podcast. We are on basically every podcast platform. I hope you will rate us and review us there and share it. And I'm on Twitter a little bit too much as Ilana_Brooklyn. That's ELANA_Brooklyn. And stay tuned. We definitely have more comics coverage coming up, I assure you, and including some deep dives into some older work as well. So, as we always like to say on the show, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.